guys, it's Amanda. Welcome back to my channel. My husband and I recently purchased this Tonal, which is the newest smart home gym equipment, and I can say that we absolutely love this thing. The only downside is finding a way to organize the different pulleys when they're not in use. Tonal sells a shelf separately to hang them, but it's a bit pricey, so I set out to see if I can make an alternative that's as sturdy and sleek looking as their own. I found a company selling 3D printed clips that you can mount to your own floating shelf. I purchased these and made my own floating shelf with a cover on the bottom to hide the clips inside. The link to these clips is in the description box below. Start by marking your studs and measuring the distance between them. I like to use blue painter's tape to mark out where the shelf is going to be so I can get a visual of what it's going to look like when I'm done. Here I used the tape to mark out a 30-inch shelf to see what it would look like, but after thinking about it and doing some research, I decided that a 24-inch shelf was all that I needed. I used a basic plan for a floating shelf, but if you'd like to see some more detail on this, I highly recommend checking out Anna White's video on floating shelves. She has a very detailed video that shows you how to build some really sturdy shelves. I'll link that video above. I started with a 1x6 board to make this shelf 7 inches wide. However, you can make this shelf as wide as you want, starting with any size of dimensional lumber. I cut the first piece at 22.5 inches, and then I took a 1x4 board and cut two 5.5-inch pieces from that. I assembled each of the 5.5-inch pieces to the end of the 22-inch piece using wood glue and nails. Next, I took the remainder of the 1x4 board and marked the cuts for the side pieces. Each of these side pieces should measure to 24 inches exactly, but I find that marking the cuts on the actual shelf results in a perfectly flush seam every single time. Alternatively, you could miter the corners on the shelf if you were going to stain it, but since I'm going to be sanding and painting the shelf, I wasn't too concerned about the end pieces showing. Repeat this for the other side of the shelf and assemble with wood glue and nails. Next, I took a 2x3 board and marked the inside diameter of the shelf. These pieces of 2x3 are going to go inside the shelf to give it a little bit more support. To hold the clips on the inside of the shelf, I used a 1/2 inch by 5.5 inch piece of MDF board. However, you could also use a piece of 1/2 inch plywood and cut this to the inside dimensions of your shelf. Measure on the inside of the shelf where it will be mounted to the wall studs, and then mount your 2x3 pieces on the inside of the shelf away from these markings. I use nails to attach the 2x3s to the front side of the shelf, and then I use screws on the back side where no one will be able to see them. With the floating shelf assembled, it was time to prep the surface for paint. I used my new tool I found on Amazon. It's a spring-loaded nail punch that's used to set the nail heads below the surface. I filled in the gaps left by the nail heads and left it to dry while working on the inside of the shelf. On this 1/2 inch piece of MDF, I marked 4 evenly spaced spots to mount the tonal clips. The clips come in a few different colors, and you can also buy sets of 6 or 8 if you have more than the standard 4 attachments for your tonal. They feel extremely sturdy and come with a lifetime guarantee on holding the weight of the equipment. The last piece to cut was a 1/4 inch piece of plywood that's going to act as the bottom for the shelf. I cut the width at 5.5 inches and then marked it against the shelf again to find the length. Once it was cut, it fit pretty snugly on the inside of the shelf, so I used 2 pieces of painter's tape on the side to act as handles so I could easily get it out. I put a little black paint on the clips to mark where I needed to make the cuts on the bottom piece. This helped to center each cutout exactly where it needed to go in order to get the clips in and out easily. Once those were all marked, I grabbed my router jig to make a 1/4 inch groove parallel to the inserts on the clips. I tested the first one to make sure that it worked and then finished up the other 3. I found that this bottom piece was sitting just a tiny bit higher than the edge of the shelf due to the height of the clips. So I routed an additional groove perpendicular to the first one, but this time I didn't go all the way through the plywood, just enough to get it to sit flush with the edge of the shelf. I sanded all the outside pieces with 150 and 220 grit sandpaper, then covered it with 2 coats of black paint and 3 coats of polyurethane. The last thing I did before mounting the shelf was glue 4 1/2-inch pieces of wood to the sides of this insert. This is where the bottom piece will be mounted once everything is assembled on the wall. Once everything was dry, it was time to mount it on the wall. I used 4 3-inch screws going directly into the studs. Make sure to countersink these screws so the clip insert will sit flush against the inside. Add the insert with the clips, driving the screws directly into the 2x3 pieces. This insert will hold the weight of the equipment, so make sure it is secure. I used 4 screws, 2 going into each of the 2x3s. Lastly, add the bottom piece of the shelf and test that the T-clips are still able to be inserted properly. Add wood glue to the bottom piece of plywood and use clamps to hold it in place while the glue dries. Here is how it looks with all of the equipment. I love how organized this looks on the wall instead of sitting in a pile on the floor. If you ever need to move or take down the shelf, simply use a screwdriver to pry open the bottom piece and remove the screws in the same order you put them in. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the description box below for links on where to purchase these tonal clips, and I'll see you in the next video.